Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Secure Data and Infrastructure, Ransomware Avoidance and Recovery. This special webinar event is brought to you in partnership with Rubrik and produced by Actual Tech Media. Thank you so much for joining us on this event. We've got a great presentation lined up for you, and we'll be spending a lot of time doing some Q&A at the end of the webinar as well. I know whenever we talk about ransomware avoidance and prevention and recovery, these are always hot topics for the Actual Tech Media audience. So we encourage your questions on this topic, especially so many companies out there are just being hit left and right with ransomware. So make sure you do whatever you can do to avoid that kind of malicious attack, because when it happens, it's painful. And so we're here to help. I have an expert from Rubrik who I'll be introducing you to in just a moment, who is here to help you avoid ransomware any way you can and recover as rapidly as possible should you get hit with a ransomware attack. Now, before we jump into it, and I introduce you to our presenter, my name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'll be serving as your moderator. We encourage you to use the questions box there in your audience console. Many of you have already found that, but I will call your attention to it that way. And we'll be queuing up the best questions for our dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so get your questions in early. We also have a couple of links there in the handouts tab, one of them to the blog post that our presenter will talk about on recovering fast from ransomware attacks, the magic of an immutable backup system. So make sure that you check that blog post out. And of course, a link there to Rubrik.com as well for additional information on the Rubrik solution. We'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card at the end of the event today. All prize terms and conditions can be found there in the handouts tab. The primary condition being you must be present on the event for the drawing. And then new for this year, we started a best question prize as well for a $50 Amazon gift card. We'll contact the winner of that gift card after the event, and the same prize terms and conditions do apply. So with that, I'm excited now to introduce you to our expert presenter. I'm excited to bring on Jeff Inui, who is a technical marketing architect at Rubrik. Jeff, it's always great to have you on. Excited to hear your presentation today. Take it away.
Thanks, David. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Greatly appreciate your time as we dive into the topic of secure data and infrastructure. A little bit about me. My name is Jeff Inui. I'm a technical marketing architect here at Rubrik. Majority of my past experience has actually been in customer operations, everything ranging from technical help desk to architecture roles. So a few objectives for today. I want to take a step back, right, and really think about the challenge that we're facing today. We have to trust the security and the integrity of our backups. So we're going to look at a couple customer stories, go into some common ransomware trends that we've seen, and then we'll go into a technical deep dive of our immutable architecture and how that can help. So as we go through the presentation, think about your backup strategy, your business continuity plans, and also the level of effort that's required to meet those goals. All right, so backups are a critical part of the defense in depth approach, right? So they're always going to be the last line of defense and what you go to if some sort of event happens. In the case of malware, a typical scenario is where an attacker will actively seek out backup files. So when they encrypt data, they can prevent any sort of recovery and have more leverage for demanding a ransom. We'll discuss this in further detail, but this is where Rubrik really shines, right? The design has been built for this sort of scenario, and it truly makes a difference. So an example of this is Kern Medical Center. They adopted Rubrik with a rollout of their new EMR, and shortly after, they actually had a ransomware attack. They were able to quickly recover 100% of their data and mission-critical systems. So after this event, they were so impressed. They went out, they bought more Rubrik, and they expanded it to their legacy footprint as well. In a more recent case of the city of Durham, they were actually struck by a ransomware attack that hit the core of their systems and applications. This brought essentially the city to a halt in terms of IT. All right, so with the help of Rubrik, they had implemented and protected all of their critical information. So the city was able to recover the systems, the applications, and the data. In addition, a shout out to the support teams and the account teams. They provided full 24/7 coverage and assistance as the city brought their systems back online. So you hear about these stories in the news a lot, and you really have to ask the question to yourself, what trends and themes are we seeing when it comes to these ransomware attacks? And the unfortunate fact is that they're becoming far more intelligent, right? The reality is that we have small and overworked teams, and they understand this, right? It's hard to be able to have a team or a small group of engineers that can take on the task of trying to mitigate these risks. So everything from the monitoring, the detection, the mitigation efforts can be really difficult when things like a master boot record is encrypted or a primary data store, has been encrypted or deleted. These have become the key attack targets for attackers because of the consolidated nature of virtualized environments. When you think about these stories, you kind of say, let's not worry about that, right? We have backups. That would be a terrible situation, but we would have backups. This really reminds me of when I was in operations and I'm sitting at the keyboard and I'm getting close to the go, no-go of an application rollout or an infrastructure change that, could lead to a very long night. There's just a lot of clarity, in those situations when it comes to your backups. The problem here is, again, the malicious software and the attackers are going after backups because they're so readily available in legacy architectures. So the previous event that I was talking about is a controlled event. If it's an uncontrolled event, you have been in this scenario, right? You wake up at 3 a.m., you're seeing your phone go crazy with text messages, phone calls, and the dreaded voicemail, asking what's going on. As short as 5 or 6 years ago, you wouldn't think of anything except for maybe it's primary storage or I have a network outage. But you never really thought that it would be ransomware or some sort of security event. That's just not the case these days, right? The question that we have to ask ourselves is, where's the solution to this? There's so much anxiety around the security of backups themselves. And the key to that, and the answer, is to have immutable backups. The definition of that is, for us, is going to be, hey, once it's written, it can't be read, modified, or deleted by clients on the network, right? It can't be exposed to systems outside. So our architecture goes beyond simple file permissions or external storage protocols to establish immutability. So that means that we can confidently ensure the integrity and recoverability of backups when we need them. So immutability is definitely a hefty claim. Let's take a deeper look at how we accomplish this. So there are 3 key areas that we take a look at. First is the file system. So this has been designed from the ground up to be immutable and distributed for the sole purpose of our application. The second is that there's a zero trust design. So this is the same model that is used by large cloud providers to allow multitudes of services to run in a secure fashion. The third is the ability to automate using a secure and authenticated workflow. So what this means is this can enable engineers to achieve tangible results with infrastructure as code, config management, and continuous integration, all while being very secure. So let's take a deeper look at the file system itself, and we'll contrast that to legacy file systems that we've seen. All right, so this is the traditional diagram that you see of what you would get in a legacy backup architecture. The first thing you'll notice here is there's going to be lack of security measures for standard protocols with weak authentication. The second is that there's going to be mutable data constructs, right? Writes are done in place, so there's no guarantee that the content hasn't changed since being ingested. And lastly, there's no data validation or fingerprint validation upon recovery. So what you back up isn't necessarily guaranteed as something that is recovered. So again, with immutability claims, we need to make sure that upon recovery, what we backed up is what we are recovering. So let's take a look at Rubrik's file system, which we call Atlas. This was built truly with the application in mind, which is the Rubrik software stack. So it's, again, developed as an immutable file system with the ability to scale horizontally. So for infrastructure engineers, this is very important because we maintain the immutability, which is our security construct, and the ability to scale these data sets that continually grow and grow and grow. We can do that horizontally, right? So the forklift upgrade, that's a thing of the past. We don't want to implement a product that can't scale horizontally. Backup data is never exposed to external clients through insecure methods, and all writes are done out of place. So writing out of place, what does that mean? It really means that we're doing append only. So if we take a look at the logical layer, Rubrik services are ingesting data and then writing the files to the internally mounted file system. So the patch files can be appended, and they represent data that we are ingesting from your system. So as we generate these patch files, we logically divide them into patch blocks, and each one of these blocks has a CRC. So what we can do with that is we can actually produce a fingerprint file. So when we compare the patch file with the fingerprint file, we can validate that what we backed up is what we are recovering. So in the background, there's actually going to be operations which maintain integrity of your backups. And that's what the second bullet point is taking a look at. So every time that we perform any sort of data inspection, we read the fingerprint so we know that the data hasn't been tampered with. Also, there's an enforcement for the fingerprint files to be stored in the same directory as the patch files, and they can't be separated. So if we jump to the other side, which is the physical layer, we'll receive data from the upstream Rubrik services. These are all signed communications, by the way. They will send data chunks to physical devices. So our disk drives and our SSDs within the system itself. All of our patch files are divided up by Atlas into stripes. And then from there, we create these chunks that are then passed to our erasure coding scheme and distributed across the cluster. This is for resiliency. So again, we talked about this previously, but we continually will do CRC checks to ward against bit rot, disk failure, corruption, the cosmic bit flip, if you will. And the third key factor here, which is very important, is that this validation is completely enforced across the cluster and can't be turned off or on. And this is another checkpoint of, we want to make sure that what we're recovering is what we backed up. And this is what the inline read validation does. So when you restore data, we talked about the CRCs and the fingerprint file, we will actually validate that the patch file matches up with the fingerprint file so that we can make sure and recover data that we backed up from that point in time. So let's jump into the second topic, which is the zero trust cluster design. So again, let's take a look at the legacy full trust design. Right, so the first thing you're going to notice here is there's going to be insecure communications, or likely so. Most nodes are going to be able to talk to each other on the same subnet. IP whitelisting is it's not going to be effective, for modern attacks. The second is that you're going to have a very large attack surface when it comes to external backup file systems, right? So you're going to have repositories that are sitting out there, built on OSs that are composed by administrators. All right, these are all things that you have to harden and make the attack surface very, very large. And the third is that you could also have rogue services, within these environments, because you are running applications on top of operating systems that are all administrator controlled, and this essentially just widens the attack surface for malicious code, human error, or other types of issues. So when you take a Rubrik cluster and our zero trust cluster design, you're going to see something very different, right? We're going to validate each node that wants to exchange data. There's a certificate-based mutual authentication. There's TLS 1.2 with strong cipher suites, and there's a tight coupling of the file system atlas and the individual nodes within the cluster, and that's a stark contrast compared to the legacy architecture, which has those islands of storage that sit out that are very decoupled. Right, there's less control for the cluster and the nodes themselves. So as a key highlight here, there's 5 topics that we want to talk about. But really what you want to understand is that Rubrik ships out of the box secured and hardened. And honestly, customers shouldn't have to worry about that. So the first line item here is that we don't want to be able to mount the snapshot data from a file system, right? Atlas disallows this. We also want to make sure that we are authenticating all services and lessening the attack surface for malicious code or other issues that can come up. In the underlying operating system, we've also configured IP tables, things like this to mitigate and limit the amount of services that can be run. Fourth here, the software images are signed by authorized personnel. So really what this boils down to is that it's all automated and very handy for the end user, because the bits are automatically validated upon bootstrap or upgrade of the system itself. Right? So if the signature doesn't match, we're not going to boot up the system. We've also stripped down and hardened the product itself. Again, really the theme here is that out of box, the customer shouldn't have to worry about this. And this is something that we provide as a service to our customers today. Okay, so the last piece here is the authenticated APIs and the tooling that surrounds that. Let's take a look at the extensibility concerns with the traditional software stack for backups, right? So really the biggest piece here is that the underlying operating system, that's usually built by administrators. And when it comes to APIs, the first thing you're probably going to notice is that there is a lack of an API at all, right? Most of these systems require administrator or root level access to the underlying operating system and the file system to just generally operate, and that's a bad thing. If they do have an API, a lot of times it can be a bolt-on. Usually it's limited to basic authentication, so we're tossing username and passwords around the network. These are not good things, especially when we're trying to automate in a secure fashion. The third is that we have a mutable configuration. Right? There's a mutable construct within the database that sits within these software stacks. So if we have something like this implemented, we would have to put in something like a tripwire that would say, hey, there's been a system registry change or a config file change. How would we actually know that what is going on is something that we intend? This is the problem of extensibility within our legacy architectures today. Now contrast that to Rubrik's design, which is an API-first design. We authenticate all endpoints And extensibility has to adhere to the same level of security requirements that are inherent to the system, right? So if you're making a call through an SDK or the CLI or the GUI for that matter, it's all going to funnel through the same system security requirements that we have built into the system. Right? This is all done, again, out of box, so it makes it very convenient and makes the product a lot easier to manage and use. So that is a ton of content, but let's summarize what we covered here today. So the first thing, immutability. What does that mean? In short terms, it means that no security exposure can tamper with our backups. This really needs to be a fundamental component of any backup architecture design. And the way that we are able to do that at Rubrik is we have the distributed immutable file system atlas. We have a zero trust cluster design, and we authenticate APIs and all our tools. So remember at the beginning of the presentation, I asked you to think about your current backup architecture and what that looks like to you today. I really hope that this presentation has been enlightening to that process of thought, right? How we can change or better provide services to our organizations when it comes to backup. So I know there's this is a lot of information, but honestly, there's a ton more. So if you want to, please take a few minutes and check out the link to the blog post, and it dives in deeper to the subjects that we covered today. Again, I thank you all for your time and attention today. David, back to you.
All right, great presentation, Jeff. Really appreciate that. I learned a lot about ransomware prevention and recovery just from that. So thank you so much. We do have a lot of good questions coming in for you from the audience. I want to remind everyone about our best question prize we're running. I see a lot of you have already submitted questions, but if a question's on your mind right now about ransomware prevention or the Rubrik solution specifically, now's the time to get it in. So with that, Jeff, are you ready for some Q&A?
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Let's see where to start. So many good questions coming in. One of the first ones I wanted to ask you, this one came in, they're asking about deduplication. Specifically, does this work at the block level? How does dedup work with Rubrik?
Yeah, so for the CDM product that we highlighted in the presentation, right, this is our physical appliance, our cluster that scales, right? So in terms of deduplication, we do it at the block level. And in most cases, it is going to be fixed. And that's, obviously the comparison is, variable deduplication is more effective in terms of space conservation. But what we've done is we try to weigh the balance between space efficiency and the ability to recover quickly, right? So the deduplication does work at the block level, but it's tuned per workload, right? So we have different profiles for databases or virtual machines that operate different in terms of deduplication. But the key idea again is that we want to be able to recover quickly and maintain some space efficiency.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. Moving on to the next question. How can Rubrik provide better TCO than other options available out there in the market?
Yeah, so I mean, TCO is certainly a big part, of Rubrik campaigns, and as customers come on board, most of the time it's a span of 3 to 5 years in the outlook of the change that goes on within an organization. A lot of times there's initiatives that the current product that a customer is using just can't accomplish, or it's not on the roadmap at all. Right, so there's certain things that overcome the TCO, but when it comes down to bottom line, the dollars and cents of it, is that we're able to leverage a lot of the components that the customers want to use that are very efficient in terms of price. Right, so if we look at the cloud storage economics, right, that's a very handy lever for us because we're able to easily implement those solutions and save the customer money.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Let's see. We answered that one. Next one. So, you talked about ransomware recovery, and I know we've got the blog post here that talks about how to recover fast. But the question is specifically if you have files that are infected, maybe they're already backed up with Rubrik. What would you do at that point to get your data back? Would you go back to previous versions, or how would that work?
Yeah, so I mean the snapshots themselves, when you recover them, and I've been in incidents like this. You have to do security remediation, right, before you do recoveries. So it has to be isolated, and obviously that's our recommendation in the typical standard procedure. In terms of them infecting other, I guess the system itself, that's not technically possible with our particular product, because these are just contained. The snapshot is contained as a file within the system itself. So when we recover, of course, if there's something that is malicious there, it could spread. So that's why you have to perform it in a staged process, right? So you can go down to the file level, or you can recover a virtual machine or a handful of virtual machines in the isolated environment where you can do your scans and remediation before you recover fully.
Okay, great advice. And would you call that when you recover? You make sure you do it in a secure.
Yeah, so it's an isolated environment. Mm-hmm.
Isolated environment,
and that's what our customers have done. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so based on experience, when I had a security manager come to me say, hey, there's been some sort of issue, we would always put that into a staged environment where we knew it was isolated, that where we could use our tools to make sure that it was safe for production.
Got it. Okay. Next question is around what type of workloads can Rubrik protect? They list out, bare metal servers, virtual, cloud workloads. Can Rubrik do all of the above?
Yes, all of the above. I did see another question regarding agents. So we have both agent and agentless. Most of our customers, do deploy the agentless solution for virtual machines. That's very effective. But anything that's application-based, like SQL or Oracle, those are going to be agent-based.
Got it. And that's for application.
Oh, and I should include bare metal. Yes. Yep.
That's for application consistency.
That's correct. Yep.
Okay. And then here's an interesting question, kind of at a high level around ransomware from Heather. When you see companies that are hit with ransomware, have you sort of seen any similarities, commonalities between these companies?
Yeah, I think we all know that, I've seen the public sector, being hit the hardest. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily behind the commercial space, but a lot of times they just don't have the infrastructure that's built out that commercial organizations have, and really that they're vulnerable to a lot of legacy systems. So we have certainly seen a commonality, as everyone else has in the news, about the public sector.
Absolutely, yeah. Public sector seems to be getting hit hard. Next question. I think you talked about the TCO of Rubrik, but just in comparison to other, kind of well-known backup solutions, what have you seen that really makes a Rubrik stand out the most?
Yeah, it's kind of the things that we talked about, right? Just the level of effort that is required to build out what we consider legacy solutions, right? Those architectures are old. They've been around for 20 plus years. There's just a lot of lifting. There's a lot of hardening that has to take place in order for those products to be resilient, as opposed to ours where it's, out of the box, right? That work is done for you. And that's really where we find the premium in the product itself.
Very nice. Very nice. And to clarify, Rubrik can back up workloads that are running in the public cloud. Is that true?
It is, yeah. And we didn't really talk about that. That's one of our other products, which we call Polaris. So Polaris actually lives in the cloud, and we essentially can connect these clusters. So I'm trying to think of, I'm waving my arms around here a little bit. But say you take an organization that has 5 sites, we could have Rubrik clusters at each one of those sites, and then we can essentially have a management plane with Polaris, right? So that connects all of those clusters together and federates all of those services. And in terms of cloud, we're able to essentially use Polaris to connect to customer clouds and back up virtual machines or databases from public cloud providers. So the technology is a little bit different, obviously, because it's purely API based, and that's all brokered through Polaris itself.
Excellent.
That's a great topic too, by the way, for the next webinar.
Absolutely. Yeah, we need to cover that. That sounds very cool. Another question is around replication and disaster recovery. In the scenario you just talked about, you've got multiple sites, you've got the public cloud. I would assume that Rubrik can replicate data off-site, say to get it off premises onto either into the public cloud or into another location with a Rubrik cluster. Is that how it works?
Yep, 100%. Yeah, we support replication. And the typical model is that if a customer has twin data centers, they can cross-replicate, and then they can archive to a public cloud, right? So a lot of times we can reduce the amount of product that a customer has in a secondary site, or oftentimes we can get rid of that entirely.
Excellent. And then I know in your presentation you talked about firewall rules and IP filtering, things like that. A question here from Stefano about just how complex are the Rubrik security measures and filtering, or is that done really in the network?
Yeah, so that's actually baked within the product itself, right? So that slide was essentially pointing out how we harden the product, because we have an underlying operating system and then our software stack. Those pieces have to be hardened. So I guess the comparison is if you have a traditional backup architecture, you're going to have say Windows OSs or Linux OSs that you have to harden prior to the software stack that has to be applied. I hope that answers the question at hand.
Yeah, absolutely. And then is it possible for Rubrik to somehow analyze the backup metadata or changes to the backup data to identify unusual behavior, for example, that might identify or discover a ransomware attack?
Yes, so that's actually one of our modules. It's called Radar. And we released that about 1.5 years ago, I believe. But that lives within the Polaris product line. So what we can do is that we can analyze the metadata. We can identify change rates and different file attributes, and then we can detect if there's some sort of event.
Very cool. And then actually, here's a follow-up question that just kind of ties on right there. So let's say you identify this ransomware attack, it's happening, data is being encrypted. The question is, how quickly can I restore? And I'm sure, of course, that varies on a lot of different factors. But how would someone know how quickly they can get their data back?
Right. So this is actually a really good topic for, again, the next webinar. But that's with Radar, we're able to identify at the individual file level, right? So you can see the change rate of an individual file, right? Because we didn't cover this because this is more in our this is, I guess, away from security. But when we ingest, say, a virtual machine, we're going to index all the files within that virtual machine, right? So Rubrik is going to know about that, and then Polaris will also know about that as well. So we can do essentially scanning or have an understanding of the file changes. And then if you see like exposure or say like a group of files changes in a finance folder on a share, you can 2-click restore that. we'll kick that command off or that API call down to the cluster, and then we can perform the recovery. So it's very elegant in the way that we're using the metadata, to our advantage.
Nice, nice. And speaking of using metadata and kind of analyzing the data, there's a question here around identifying personally identifiable information, the PII. Is that a module, or is that possible with the Rubrik solution?
It is. So that is an additional module within Polaris. It's called Sonar. And again, you kind of get hopefully everyone's kind of understanding the high level picture of what we're doing. But when we're taking backups, we're also now doing a further inspection of the files themselves, right? So we can look at content within those files, and then we can send that to Polaris within the customer's account. They're essentially a tenant. And then we can, perform, I guess, apply different tools to that. And I understand more or less what's going on, right? If there's certain categories of, personal information, these are all built-in templates, by the way, which is very nice. So you could take a file share and then understand, hey, do I have any sort of information like that falls within, these guidelines?
Got it. Got it. Okay, that's nice. I like all those different modules to extend the functionality and really leverage this data that you already have to protect. So you might as well leverage it in multiple ways. Next question. When people think about immutable file systems, you think, well, I can't delete the data, I can't change the data. But there's a couple questions here around backup retention. After a certain period of time, I want to delete the data because I don't want it anymore. I assume that's possible with a backup policy still, even though this is immutable data.
Yes, that's correct. So that's a core of our product itself, right? So instead of creating the backup jobs, where you essentially have to schedule, all those pieces, right? The life cycle of the backup itself. That's all folded up into our SLA policy. So the typical scenario is that we'll take backups for 30 days, and then we'll start to take monthly backups, and then annual, say for however many years. So you can schedule that within a single SLA policy, and then you can really define how you want to manage the data and how that life cycle happens, right? So you don't have to schedule different jobs for different workloads. You can just apply that to databases, virtual machines, or NAS shares, for example. So it's very, very homogeneous in terms of its application.
Excellent. And then there's a couple of questions here around specific workloads. For example, backing up of containers or Kubernetes, and then also protecting Microsoft SQL workloads.
Yeah, so in terms of Kubernetes, that is a roadmap for us, but that will be a module within Polaris. SQL is actually kind of the flip side here. That is again going to be agent based, but we didn't cover any of the live mount features or any of the other things that we talk about. But those are very, very advantageous, right, for administrators, because when I was in that seat, SQL restores are something that not a lot of people want to do, and it takes a lot of resources. So we are able to extend our live mount feature, where we can actually mount the snapshot, say, of a database, and present that back to, say, tester development or production, where a DBA can have full read-write access to that database from a point in time that you choose. And all this is automated, by the way, so you don't have to really have the fear of performing a recovery for something like SQL. This is something that anyone on the staff can do.
Nice, nice. Very nice. Let's see. What about scalability of the solution? There's a question here about, they have a very large SAP HANA database. Any potential to back that up and scale up to that application?
Yeah, so we do have integrations with SAP HANA. We can back that up. In terms of the object size, because really that's the way that we view it here at Rubrik, is that um, whether it's a virtual machine or a database, we don't necessarily care. Once it lands in the system, we just consider that an object within the system. So if you take, for example, some of our larger clusters, will span over 100 nodes. So our largest device is, I believe, 90 terabytes. Sorry, I should know that right off the top of my head, but it keeps expanding. But you can kind of do the simple math there in terms of scalability to accommodate that.
Excellent. And there's a couple questions here around kind of the pricing model, like you talked about different modules, or say someone was considering Rubrik as a new backup solution, replacing a existing solution. How would they know the cost of Rubrik? What's the pricing model there?
Yeah, so the general pricing model that most customers go with is all subscription based. So both our customers as well as our business itself, we prefer that. I it's funny, I keep going back to my operations experience, but I had a manager that they love the subscriptions because they can it's an a la carte, or we can subscribe to a particular plan, and then we know predictably what the costs are going to be year after year. So there's many different ways to skin that cat. But most of our customers do go with the subscription base, because they can know that their on-prem workloads are covered, as well as the future of public cloud workloads as well.
Excellent. And then does that subscription price vary based on specific workloads? Like if you need an agent for Oracle or whatever, is that going to change the subscription price?
Oh, I see. Yeah, no. So that's all inclusive. So that's another, I guess, from the accounting side, which I sort of dreaded when I was in ops. But yeah, so everything is included. It's basically all you can eat once you become a customer.
Nice. Nice. Let's see. So many good questions here. What about, this is an interesting one. What about Rubrik, the backup platform itself, being misconfigured, let's say by an admin? Are there best practices, or is there some way that you would recommend, to avoid that kind of thing where, we've heard of ransomware attacks where people they took down the firewall and they forgot to put it back up, or they put no password on the root account or something like that. What about security best practices for the backup platform?
Yeah, so most of that is rolled into the product. Your general baseline of hardening procedures, but there are external pieces that customers do have to follow, and we encourage that heavily. So things like securing NTP and managing passwords, all those things apply. However, I do have a lot of customers that their networks are on they're honestly really flat, and they trust the services and the configuration of our box. Once they implement it, as they move towards a more secured network, right? So what they always tell me is that it's better than what they're doing today, so we can use this now, and then as we progress, we can do further security measures.
Got it. Okay. Paul is asking about what sort of authentication or security is around the Rubrik API to ensure that the API isn't used to actually, somehow infect the backup or delete the backup data.
Yeah, I mean that's something that that's a really good question, because most people think, hey, I want to protect the UI, or like a bad actor. But the API is something that we need to make sure that is authenticated, right? So the same methods are used that we use in the user interface, right? So you can use username and password. However, we heavily recommend that you use something like a token-based procedure, because you can take that token and then you can store it in a vault.
Excellent. Yeah, good idea. Philip is asking, so if back to the question we had about immutable backup data, and it can be deleted via, say, a backup retention policy, how could they still then protect the data to make sure that a malicious person or account or agent or something doesn't delete the data?
Right. So if it's something that's going to be external, those are going to be handled by the general hardening procedures and security measures that are taken, as we build the product itself, right? So the other side is, how do we protect, like, someone modifying an SLA, right? There is essentially a lock on that if a customer chooses, that will essentially completely lock out the SLA policy and all of the snapshots that are associated to it. Right, so we have a retention lock. It's like a legal hold type of scenario, where we want to make sure that customers have the ability to prevent something like a administrator that's going to be doing something that's malicious, or have malicious intent.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. And then you mentioned Polaris Radar. Paul is asking, how does that kind of fit into the architecture? Is that something that runs, say, in the cloud? Do you install that locally? Where does that actually work?
Yeah, so essentially it's actually very elegant in terms of the implementation, because all the bits are there in terms of the CDM product, which is the on-prem solution. So we turn that on in the customer's account, and then automatically we'll start to analyze that data. So I guess one key point here is that it's just the metadata that's being uploaded to the customer's tenant account and their individual database. It's not shared. So no data actually leaves any one of the sites.
Cool. Well, that is a nice design. Next question, they're asking really about migration. They've got an existing backup solution. They're interested in transitioning to Rubrik. That's, I'm sure, a large hurdle for some companies, depending on the size of their backup data. Does Rubrik offer support or consulting or anything like that, or do that through third parties when it comes to that migration?
Yeah, so we have our own internal professional services organization that can handle all those needs.
Excellent. That's nice. And then, let's see, this is a long question. I'm just reading it here. What about reporting when it comes to all these different, backup repositories and production versus development and different business units and divisions, let's say at a company, and you've got this large backup repository? Does Rubrik offer insights or analytics or reporting to kind of help break down what all that data is and who it belongs to?
Yeah, so there's feature reporting, or excuse me, there's I guess general reporting within Polaris as well as CDM. So it really depends on the target and what the customer really wants to see. But yeah, so I guess there's two ways to do that. You can do that through Polaris, or you can do that through the on-prem solution, which is CDM.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. Well, we answered so many of these questions, but I'm afraid we're starting to run out of time. Jeff, unless you see any questions out here that catch your eye that you specifically want to answer?
Nope. I think we covered a lot of good stuff here.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much to everyone out there in the audience for all the excellent questions. I know we wanted to keep this relatively short, help everyone, learn a lot about ransomware prevention and the Rubrik solution, and then help you to get back to work. So let's go ahead and wrap up today's webinar because we're starting to run out of time here. Before we go, I do want to announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card. That's going to Therese Ducanis from California. Therese Ducanis from California. Congratulations. And we'll reach out to our best question prize winner after the event today. I want to remind everyone to check out the handout that's there in your audience console. As Jeff recommended, it is a blog post on recovering fast from ransomware attacks, the magic of the immutable backup architecture that Rubrik provides that you learned about on the webinar today. A really good post out there by Mr. Chris Wall. I read it myself. I hope that you'll check that out to learn more about the value that the immutable backup architecture provides. Jeff, I want to thank you so much for your excellent presentation. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
And thank you to Rubrik for supporting today's webinar. And of course, thank you to our audience for being on. Hope that you learned a lot and have a great day. For more information on the Rubrik solution, visit rubrik.com. Bye-bye.